develop a set of studies supported by a Sharp Insight grant, and these are my colleagues on the grant. And I just realized I spelled my last colleague's name wrong because she spells McEwen differently. So I think in some ways in this particular paper, I am preaching to the choir in this room. These are things that you've all thought about. The papers today have been these really great, amazing bespoke applications for specific learning that in many cases you have specifically created yourself to make work for the learning outcomes you want to get to. But I think if we think about how VR might be adopted in education in general, this is not what we're going to see. We're going to see educators going, oh, I heard VR is really good because it's immersive. And so I'm going to do some VR thing with my kids in my classroom, and I'm going to get administration to spend a bunch of money on VR headsets or however it's going to work. And then they're going to try it, and it's going to be not great. It could be clunky. The kids think it's novel for a minute, but then they get frustrated with what they can and cannot do in these particular settings. And so this paper, position paper, is just kind of a walk through different affordances that educators might think about and how they might align with their particular learning outcomes for what they might want to do in a more general sense. And so we start with affordances. I actually started off as an interpersonal scholar and then did a lot of work in social media affordances and other kinds of design affordances. And so thinking about the relationship between the object of the technology and the user and how that relationship offers possible and actual outcomes. And of course, the interesting thing in VR is that we have lots of different kinds of affordances. We have the affordances of the object, right? What can I do with this virtual block? We have the design affordances. How can the user interact with that block? And then we have the social affordances. Does the way that I'm interacting in this environment signal some kind of message to co-present others? And so in our work, one of the first kind of affordances we're thinking about, and it is a position paper, and we can have an argument over this next one is actually an affordance, is fidelity. And so we've been thinking a lot about why do classrooms have to look like classrooms? And again, when you use prepackaged software or you use the sort of solutions that are going to be sold to schools, you do get a lot of these, here's a space that looks exactly like this space, right? Or a lecture hall. And you sort of have this question of, well, if I'm in VR and it can be anything, why is it a classroom, right? Why am I not in a solar system or out here, et cetera? And so we're doing a set of studies where we're thinking about that there might be some reasons for it to be a classroom, and there might be some reasons for it not to be a classroom. And so if we have a space, flip back, and all of these are created by students in our lab, if we have a space like this one, which is a direct replication of a kind of sad little classroom we have at UTM, versus one that's a little bit more fantastical, do you get different kinds of cognition? And so we're looking at, and we've just sort of wrapped up some data collection on, if I give you a didactic learning task, does it help you that you're in a classroom and you didn't also have to figure out what is this weird space in this thing? But then if I give you a collaborative creative task, is it more helpful if you are in sort of a weird fantastical space and help you to sort of think outside of the box? And so that's the one that we're really thinking about and working on. And then there's a set of affordances that I think are particularly important for educators. And the big one's immersion. And I'm sure that you'll also end up in the sort of educational tech spaces with the salespeople, right? And you have probably heard this sales pitch of, you should use VR in education. VR is the future of education because it's immersive. And I always had this moment of like, what theory suggests that immersion is more useful for which particular learning outcome? And they always have a great quote by Jeremy Valenson. I cannot find that quote anywhere in Jeremy Valenson's actual work, but they keep spreading it around. And so the question is, does immersion focus attention, right? We're all here together, and or does it increase cognitive load? And then how do our mixed reality tools, right? Because this is the next phase. And if it's all like, oh, it's immersive, and so that's the affordance, it's great for education. And now I put you in mixed reality, which is by definition not immersive. how does that then relate to the particular learning outcome we might be interested in? We're also particularly interested in the sort of malleability of the environment, and if you're in the room, shout out to the reviewer who was like, isn't that agency from Camel? And I know we had another Camel piece. And yes, but all of my grad students are sociology students, so it gets really difficult to use the word agency in this particular term, thinking about the environment. But does the, how can the user interact and change the environment? And I know when I've got students in different kinds of educational settings, they often get frustrated when they can't. What doesn't move? When you can't sit in the chair, you can't move things around. And so how does that lack of inclusion influence the learner's perspective? But then also, how does malleable content affect classroom management? I'm teaching university students, and I'm also saying things like, please put your chickens away, right? They have the option to have that kind of malleable content. I sort of imagine this if I take this into my middle schoolers' classroom, so many chickens, so many dinosaurs, right? And then now you have a tool that's fun, but the teacher's like, you can't use that right now. We're particularly interested in things like social presence and bandwidth. A lot of the experiences we've seen today have been students as sort of a solo learner going in. There was a couple things right on having social interaction, but if you've ever been in the experience of trying to lecture in VR, which again, we could ask the question, why are we doing that in VR, but to sort of test out these things. If I don't have a lot of facial expression from the students, it becomes difficult to feel that level of social presence. And we're thinking about bandwidth here as emotional bandwidth, right? The kinds of nonverbal cues that we can receive from our co-communicators. And so then if I put them in small groups, we're really narrowed it down to just the vocal cue, even though it feels like, we're all there in our avatars, but we are essentially puppets, right? And so it's sort of like if we're trying to have interactions as puppets. And so this can change the learning outcomes as well. And then another one that I think will be particularly important for educators is the idea of persistence. There's very little ability to take notes in VR. And so when you are doing some sort of active experiential learning, that's probably okay, right? Because we're getting the sort of embodied cognition that we've been talking about today in memory. But if we're doing something where we want to retain the information, or if we are a kind of person, you can see my notebook over there, I'm the kind of person that almost has to take notes to remember something. And now you've put me in a setting where it's difficult to write, it's difficult to type, it's difficult to record it and have it available later. We have to think about how can that lesson be persistent to students to review and to work on later. So as I said, it was a very short position paper. It's kind of nice that it went at the end. It either makes sense at the very beginning or the very end. And I think this is something we'll want to think about as the applications that you've made for your classes and specific opportunities make their way into the sort of general ed tech market. Thank you.
Questions for Greg? Yeah.
Oh, more than a question, just thank you very much for your talk. It was excellent. I think we should be talking much more about all this technology as a medium, as a communication medium, and understand its specificities. And if we use it just as simulation, we are just incorporating the handicaps and limitations of our physical world in a different medium, which already has its own limitations and difficulties. So it's a double limitation and double difficulties that we have instead of facilitating things. So this idea of changing the focus of our classroom that is typically architectural and then start doing more abstract things, but that can be really useful because we are not meant to be substituting anything with virtual reality. We're meant to be adding to the panorama of didactic tools that we have, right? And as in the previous talk, if the idea is to create and be critical about architectural spaces, then you do simulate. But if you are trying to transfer some other sort of concepts and ideas, perfect that you open up all these doors, so thank you.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Do you see sort of a hybrid approach for example, immersive technology being used for a very specific use case, not like a sledgehammer for every education scenario, but for example, chemistry lab, we can simulate dangerous situations that you couldn't actually in real life. Do you see that, or are these companies that are pitching these tools to you and other educators saying, oh, it can be used for everything?
So I think, sorry, I thought your question was going a slightly different direction to the last sentence.
Oh, go anywhere you like.
So great. It's malleable. So I think that it does, the VR as a tool has its best potential when it is for a specific use case. Right? I'm a big proponent of backwards design, and so thinking through what are the affordances as part of your how do I get to this particular learning objective is, I think, the way to go. And so you do see these. I worry sometimes as a communication scholar when I see like, we'll use a large language model for difficult conversations. I'm like, how do we know that large language models communicate like humans? On the other hand, maybe we all are going to be communicating large language models, so we better practice that more. But I do think that the specificity helps. I have a benefit of the class that I teach in VR. I've been teaching in VR since about the pandemic. I teach it as VR as a communication channel, and it's an experiential learning course. And the whole point is, when is VR useful and when is it not? This is really useful for me, right? In the classroom of like the experience of being in VR is actually the learning outcome I want you to get to. But then when I think about, are we gonna teach a specific skill set, or are we going to use this as a new kind of distributed learning, right? Because there are some, we have some other studies on the affordances of social affordances of virtual spaces, and there are some benefits sometimes over Zoom where we do feel the sense of place together, where Zoom automatically shows us that we are not in the same sense of place. But then the question for an educator becomes, why is that thing useful? So it does depend on sort of the level of the company you're talking to, right, in the ed tech space. Some are really like, this is for a specific thing and a specific design. But when it's like, oh, we're gonna have a very general classroom and this could be used for any kind of educational purpose, there's some useful reasons to do that. But there's also, that's the space where you can get into them sort of throwing around things that we think of as important conceptualizations and variables, like immersion, and they're like, this is a marketing term. And so it's just that's where that mismatch sometimes. And again, I know in this particular setting, preaching to the choir, you're like, no, of course we would think about the learning outcomes. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, actually more than a few. Thank you.
So it's interesting you mentioned backward design, so that's curriculum design.
Yeah.
Educators designing curriculum, and to me, that's always the starting point.
Oh, I can tell from
It's the
your
total,
paper, right? I was
it's
like,
the total starting point. It's not about the tool or what, you actually have to start with the curriculum. What are the learning objectives, and you have to actually map it to curriculum.
So a follow-up question.
Yeah.
What would be a learning objective that is better suited for an immersive technology versus one that isn't?
so just on the pure face of it offhand, if you had something where it was really important for students to pay attention and not be distracted, right? Then immersion is actually really helpful. And if I think about, let's say I have a proximity issue, right? I can't get the students all together geographically, so I can't monitor them directly. I have grown-up learners, right? So that helps as well. But I want them to really be like dialed in and focused. Then the immersion of VR is perhaps more helpful than something like Zoom, because on Zoom, I'm well aware that they're all also, even if they're on camera, they're all also doing this and doing this because I'm doing the faculty meetings, right? And so if I want that like we're in it, we're focused, then the immersion is useful. And all these things kind of go together too, right? We've actually been doing some work in the lab to sort of see if we can delineate sort of survey measures of operationalization of fidelity, immersion, and presence. We have actually a piece that just came out in Frontiers. So it's also important to kind of think through, they all go together in an immersive space, but then if we take that into mixed reality, we could keep the social presence, but maybe not have the immersion. And then when is that useful? Well, if I want you to be able to like see something in your space or take notes, but also feel like you're here with me, that could be a particularly useful kind of setting as well. So I really like that you said it, talked about it as a communication channel, because that's how I've come to this work as well, as a communication scholar, a media communication scholar, and going, oh, this is potentially the next interesting place where symbolic creation happens.
Like you said that we should use the immersive environment and we want the students to be focused on some particular topic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's like it from your perspective. It could be the fact that they can take it as an enjoyable or in a fun way, that it's like enjoyable environment and they're just playing around, goofing around, and they're not focusing. It could also be a like
Yes,
fun.
no, absolutely. I mean, that's the
Strategy,
chicken,
yeah,
right?
We are mostly it's you are immersive in such a virtual environment. You are playing around and you're enjoying it rather than being focused on a particular aspect of learning. Some can learn, some can do actually.
Yeah, so I think that's also where you start to think about what spaces do you want to be in. And so if you have like sort of because we want them to play sometimes, right? And so if I want you to play and run around and mess around with tools and have chickens, this is why the chickens are out, right? And have chickens and dinosaurs or whatever and be, pulling up new 3D assets and figuring those things out and playing, then I want you in a big open space and to do these things. And then when I want to have a little like mini lecture of what you're doing, I want to port you into a little room, right, where we're all here and the chickens go away, and then you focus. And so I think as educators, we all know, that we have these different tasks that we want students to do. And I think given all the great projects in the room for very specific applications, we all know that one size does not fit all. But I think it's something to keep in mind and kind of evangelize as the technology becomes adopted by broader sets of educators.
Can we thank Marie?
One thing to add.
Yep.
Yeah.
Sure.
No. Like for the education aspect, I feel like we can use the immersive environment when we know that if we're teaching someone a particular aspect of a curriculum and they will feel bored in it and they need to understand it in a practical way. So we can create that module so that they can interact and do it practically, and it will be more easy for them to understand rather than just reading through the theoretical aspects and grasping it.
Absolutely, and so don't take my piece as like, oh, we shouldn't use this because we're not needing supports this. But what you just said there, I think, is exactly what I'm trying to argue. Is like I have this, setting in mind. I want these things to happen, and I think this tool is useful for it because of these affordances. Spot on. I agree.
I think the different pedagogical uses of technology need to be more clearly researched, actually, and then documented in practice in diverse settings, learning settings, and in authentic learning settings. So it's a translation from theory to lab-based to natural learning settings. Right, to finish off, we all have to get